a little bit. So, hi everyone. My name is Amna Amin, and I'm one of the CAs for the Christ University Parliamentary Debate Tournament happening this weekend. And as a bit of background, I graduated from university just in 2021, so a pretty recent grad, just almost a year out, and I debated for Princeton. I did mostly BP, so British parliamentary debate and American parliamentary styles of debate. But excited to talk about art motions with you all today. So just as a start, I feel like one thing that's helpful to conceptualize what to think about for art motions is just a little bit of understanding of what art motions even are, because they're not necessarily the most common, or sometimes they can be quite wide ranging in terms of topic, given that art can cover everything from books and TV shows to like museum pieces. And so because of that, I thought we would just highlight some different types of motions that have been seen at other tournaments throughout the years. So you have ones that are about like regretting abstract art, which is more of the painting aspect. Limiting the amount of time that a museum can display a given piece of art is also in the art realm of topics, but more so like in displaying things. Whether or not you should reveal the identity of authors who choose to use pseudonyms and have anonymity has relations to art, but also relations to other motion topic areas such as philosophy or things like privacy. You also have whether or not art should celebrate gaining material wealth, which is like, what should art talk about? And that could be in any type of art. So that could be in music, or it could be in paintings, or it can be in YouTube videos, or lots of other things. That's an example of a motion that has a pretty wide ranging topic area, or a wide ranging list of examples to choose from. And then you also have like art and how it intersects with things like technology. So should film companies use AI to choose which films to greenlight, and how we think about how technology and objectivity and subjectivity plays into the art world as a whole. So those are some examples of motions. I think before getting into a bit more specific segmentations of what to think about when bringing up art arguments are just things to consider whenever you see an art motion being brought to you, which is what medium or type of art is being discussed and who consumes that art. I think that's a relevant question to ask because that limits the scope of the debate. So for instance, if you have a debate topic that's about like abstract art or like avant-garde art that has like a very small and niche market of like wealthier, richer people, that's a very different consumption base that has different policies or biases that you should recognize than like a superhero film, and whether you debate about that. And that can come up in relevant ways in a debate. So for instance, like if you're talking about the understandability of art, but it's art that's specifically for a market of people who've kind of studied it for a while, i.e. like people who are really into like avant-garde painted art and like buy those things, are probably people who understand it. So even if like a lay person doesn't understand it, that might not matter so much because that's not really who is aimed at consuming the art. But like a superhero movie should probably be like understood by a wide variety of people in terms of presentation because it is aimed at a wide variety of people. Then we can also think about things like, what is the usual meaning of art? Like, what are we supposed to get out of it in the world? And how would the topic of the motion change that usual meaning of art and how we consider it? And then also things like, what is the impact of art on the wider world and social justice, for instance, and things like that. So do you think that art can have like political meanings? And if so, what do those political meanings actually do? Are they just retrospectively saying that, oh, this thing is bad? Like I think there's a lot of art about, for example, like wars that happens in post-war periods that kind of talk about why these things are bad. Does that actually have an impact on the wider world or how they consider future sort of foreign policy? Or is it just more a way to kind of remember and bring together grief, and that's how it impacts the wider world? And lastly, you also have the things of who finances art, not to like make everything a financial topic and finance throw out about it, but I do think that like when you are considering the viability of an art piece, you can also talk about the financial aspects of it. So that is to say, sometimes you have art motions that ask questions of who, like whether you should compromise the integrity of the artist or the art itself. And that might be something that is actually you would consider doing if it means that the people who finance it buy into it more, that it makes it more viable, it makes it more widespread. So for example, in the like pseudonym debate topic, you might say like, well, people who finance or buy into books are really into the idea of knowing who the author is, of being able to critique it from their kind of background, etc., then it might matter in terms of financing to like get things published or get things circulated, that you're actually able to publish the art with the um, author's name in it. So those are just ways that these general questions can intersect with debates at large. So beyond those questions, I think that when you consider art and how it functions in the world, there are largely four main areas to think about, and we'll go over all of them in a bit more depth individually. So the first is the idea of what we think about the form of art itself. The next is social impact of art. The next is self-expression, and the last is entertainment. These areas are not, they're not ordered in like importance or anything. These are just four areas that sometimes are of equal importance. Sometimes one might matter more than another, but they're generally what you consider. And when you think about art in terms of debate round, you can be weighing these things against each other in the context of each art. So for instance, in some forms of art, you might think that self-expression is more important than things like form or social impact or entertainment. So for instance, if maybe you have an art debate that's about like whether people should pursue art as a hobby. Like if you're pursuing art as a hobby, you're probably not like making much of a social impact or entertaining like a wide mass of people or impacting the form of art because it's really just for yourself. So in that sort of debate, like self-expression is probably prioritized as the function versus again, if you're talking about like a big name brand like movie franchise, then entertainment is probably more important than like allowing the director to self-express themselves because it is basically there for entertainment, and that is like the stated main purpose of that form of art. So in terms of the form of art itself, we can see that oftentimes when you think about form, what you mean by that is the way that a piece exists or changes what is typical of the medium. So for instance, oftentimes like when you think about poetry, that's like a general bucket of art, but poetry can obviously have many forms, i.e., you might have a sort of um, like a haiku is an example of a form of poetry as an art because it has like very set standards of like how many syllables are in a line, etc. Or things like abstract art is a form of like painted art that is doing something different than what has usually been done in art previously. You also have like experimental music. If you listen to like atonal music, those things that like you might have music that like doesn't really have lyrics. It's just like kind of sounds that are created in studio but not from instruments, those sorts of things. Those are all like forms of art that fall under the categories of their like larger music, etc., as an example. And so when you're thinking of the form of art and why it can be valuable, even if you don't necessarily like find great pleasure in looking at abstract art that you don't understand or like listening to atonal music that is not always the most pleasant to an ear, is that oftentimes when you think about form, I think it's kind of synonymous with exploration or testing of the limits of art. So a lot of times when people are reacting or doing different forms of art, they're usually it more so as a critique to artistic movements of the past and the limitations that they presented, more so than they are about doing any of the other like functions of art, i.e., things like entertainment, self-expression, that sort of thing. So for instance, you might think of abstract art as a response to very literal forms of art that are very dominant in society and the way that artists are able to operate in before. So it's more so like someone saying, well, I don't want to always make a hyper realistic painting of a fruit bowl. And so they kind of go to the extreme of doing abstract art. And that is a response or critique to previous artistic movements. And it's almost a way of moving the genre as a whole forward for that particular brand of art, in that case, like paintings. Um, and so the reason why, even though like the original intentionality of why that form was created is like just like to critique, it can still be valuable, is oftentimes you're able to find new ways of expression through kind of these new forms that are created, even if they like weren't intended to like be some form of self-expression. So for instance, like collage art, I don't think is like, it's like a new form of art that, and the intentionality, as far as I'm aware, of how it originates, it's not to like create vision boards, but a lot of people like use collages to create vision boards and to be able to like visualize things for themselves. And so as a result of like collages being a form of art that is created and like meshing together of different images, now people have this like valuable form of self-expression and ways to find meaning that they didn't have before because this form is unique. So this, I think this like is most relevant in debates where you have like some sort of regretting of a specific artistic movement. Like you say it's bad, like people don't understand it. Like a lot of people say that sort of stuff about like the modern, postmodern art movements of like, oh, it's just like a blank white canvas displayed in a museum. But that can still be valuable as a form of art that pushes you to consider like what is valuable, how to simplify what you find, or how to express yourself and things like that. So that's the overall idea of form of art, which I think is probably like what people least is like least intuitive when you think about art debates and what art can do, is the role of form and experimenting with form in those cases. So next, I think what is oftentimes like a bit more of an intuitive way to think about art, or can seem to have like very impacts that are easy to explain and round and weigh against other things, is the social impact of art. So when we talk about this, we're talking about how art can change the way how a person sees the world. Specifically, art can do this through three mediums. So first is through like explicit messaging that can happen in art. So for example, you might have art that literally like shows war happening, or you might have art that literally like for example, like photographic pieces of art could be like literally showing war, things happening in war, like police brutality that is happening on the streets or things like that. And so what you're trying to do oftentimes in those cases is you're oftentimes trying to let people into some experience so they can empathize and sympathize with you. And that can have like negative and positive consequences that are relevant to think about in a debate. So on the positive side of explicit messaging, you're often much more able to like elicit sympathy for the movement or social issue of concern that you're trying to get across. Like I think there's a lot of popular like books nowadays that talk about the issues of like racism growing up for like kids of color. I think that's like a popular genre, like a burgeoningly popular genre of YA literature. And so it is like helpful to create sympathy because now like people who of all racial backgrounds or all like socioeconomics types can read those books and sympathize with the characters. Or I think like the more stereotypical version of this is how like, you know, rich white suburban kids in like the US and probably other like places too will often like rappers like Childish Gambino or Kendrick Lamar who talk about like very serious racial issues. And it is like somewhat of a meme to be like they enjoy it. But on the other hand, there probably is like some increase in sympathy, some pushing them to consider more liberal viewpoints, to consider the plights of these people and the way they vote or the way they interact with others. But on the other hand of that, you also have like when you think about explicit messaging, like is it always good for people to like relive violence, especially like when sometimes you might not get the subject's permission necessarily all the time, like as I think this is especially relevant when you talk about like photographic pieces of art, to have that like violence um, transmitted to art. So you might say like it's kind of unethical for you to like be profiting off of images of people like dying and suffering in war, or also just the limits of empathy, which is that some people might just say, oh, I've watched like The Blind Side or like the new like Pixar movie Soul or like The Princess and the Frog that have like um Black main characters, but don't necessarily tell very complex stories about like racial dynamics or racism in countries or structural barriers that people face. And so people can kind of say, well, if people like work hard enough and if they're industrious, then people of color can like rise to the top of society. And so there are limits of empathy. So that basically allows them to say, like, I've done my due diligence in terms of researching about the plights of others, but that due diligence doesn't actually manifest in them thinking of structural changes, rather just says like there are a few good people in this racial category that I can sympathize with because I've seen stories of them like working hard and overcoming oppression. And so those are kind of the limits of explicit messaging. The next way that you can have social impacts is oftentimes you have symbols that people put meaning to. I think this is so like relevant when you think of like anthems or like national anthems that people have. Like those are forms of art, those are music, and that people can like galvanize around or nationalize around. Like flags to some degree are pieces of art that people can have symbols to. Political parties often have like mascots associated with them. So for instance, like in the US, Republicans use like an elephant as a symbol of like their party. And so I think the value of that sort of social impact of art is that now people can like unite, like you're able to unite people across like geographic spaces or socioeconomic groups, etc., so that they can all say like, even though we're from different areas, we all unite in this group and like embody the principles of this group, etc. I think that helps make people feel like they are a part of a community, and also they're able to easily identify others who they can spot and then collaborate with or make friends with, etc. And the last idea of social impacts is this idea of cues, which is this basically how people can have implicit messages that are not explicit in the same way. Like you might not show war in a like literally like depict war and like people dying in a piece of art, but you can still like implicitly kind of comment on things like war or other things, and that people can interpret and add meaning to use. This is where you get things like allegories or metaphors, etc. So for instance, like rock and roll is like a genre of music that is really popular like in the Cold War and like after the Berlin Wall falls. And it's not like explicitly saying the Berlin Wall fell, so now we can embrace individualism, but rather like rock and roll and punk culture or sort of embracing individualism and implicitly sending messages around how it's a good thing, like both for you and how you act in your own day-to-day life, but also politically, that kind of supports this idea of individualism. So that's like more implicit messaging. And in some ways that can be a bit deeper or have less of the problems of explicit messaging, because people need to like do a bit more work to discover the meaning, and they can like customize it for their own life, because you might not run into the problems as much about like having almost like fake empathy for a certain group or um, people, or like the ethicalities of like showing violent imagery. So that's the social impact side of art, and how you can kind of see how it can be debated a bit in round, but then also how you can sort of signal to the judge examples of how it is valuable. So you can say like, oh, if this form of art has a symbol, here's why a symbol is valuable and what it means in terms of social impact. Or if a piece of art has cues, then here's why that cue is valuable and can have social impact. And then the next major function of art is this idea of self-expression. So basically, when we're talking about self-expression, what we're discussing is how the artist is able to reveal themselves or parts of themselves to the world, and also like often involves things like sharing your culture. And I think what is valuable about self-expression art is that you're trying to find a deeper way to express yourself that is often able to be done in a deeper sense than just literally writing words on a paper, right? So oftentimes, if an artist wanted to, they could just like rent a billboard space and write like "I'm angry" and like big block letters on the side of a building. But for some reason, there is a part of themselves where like anger or just like saying "I'm angry" does not do enough to self-express. And so as a result, you want to use art to more fully express your emotions in a way that can be deeply felt by the world, get people to empathize with you or get some sort of catharsis, i.e., like even if people don't empathize or fully get what you mean, you get some value in saying, at least this is a more accurate depiction of how I'm feeling, and I get to feel satisfied by that. I think this is most often debated or can be seen in debates when you're talking about promoting your culture. I think a lot of times you see debates about whether or not artists from a different culture should assimilate into the dominant form, or what you should do as someone from a particular culture when you're sharing your art, i.e., like how should you form your art? Should you make it so that it's like easily understood by the masses, or should you kind of make it a bit more true to your roots, etc.? And so I think when you're thinking about the cultural aspect, you should keep in mind that people often care about their in group, so they want to be connected to something that is bigger than themselves. And if people are able to remember the past, now they'll also remember it later. So you could be legacy building for your culture. So, for instance, this might be particularly relevant for immigrant artists, so they can like sort of create ties to their past culture or past art and in ways that allow future generations to remember that and hang on to those things. I think this is most clearly noted in like symbols that you often see from immigrant communities that are able to cross borders and become kind of dominant parts of the enclaves they're in, their new areas of interest. I think also another thing is this is also important with like the immigrant piece and how you relate to other groups. Is that oftentimes culture is a dynamic piece, so it changes over time, and so you might need to update the forms of art used to represent culture in order to more fully get tap into self-expression. So I think a good example of this can often be with music, where like people might want to preserve language or certain idioms or phrases to their like immigrant community that they've come in order to like preserve that for future generations, which is kind of the first part about building your legacy. But they might also want to relate that to the new culture that they're assimilating into. And so you might have like fusion forms of art or music where people are have like interspersed words of English or like Urdu and Hindi if they're like a like Indian subcontinent diaspora living in the West or something like that. And so having that updated form of culture where you're sort of being dynamic to your new situation and the updates of where you live, or the kind of even just like the fact that you live in the 21st century, can be a way that you're able to both self express in a valuable way while still protecting and promoting your culture for legacy building. And so self-expression art is valuable because now you're able to like in the cultural sense like share pass down legacies, but also just in the individual sense you're able to discuss an emotion that can't be felt simply through words, and that usually means you're creating something that's a bit more novel, i.e. like tens of thousands of people can say that they are angry, but it's probably unique for artists to say that, to make a painting expressing why they are angry in a certain kind of way, or to write a book that explains like a character journey about why they are angry for a certain type of way. And so it is often deeper than that. And also self-expression can be a way to form new art, which is also really good. So people might say like, I can design a short film in a certain way that is like a new form of art, and that is more accurate to my self representation. Or maybe I can create a novel that is more accurate to the lived experience that I have. So I think the author, I think Zadie Smith, for instance, like wrote a book that made sure to basically just codify the race for white people more so than it did for other characters in the book. And that's kind of like a form of self-expression, how they, as like a woman of color author, is now able to kind of show through art that like their assumptions about race and how they interpret the world and things like that are different, and is often seen like dominant forms of art as, and is like a valuable self-expression, and also like a new form of writing literature in some ways, which is kind of cool. And then lastly, the last major form of art is this idea of entertainment. So this is kind of like how art is an experience for the viewer, and that entertainment can be just like mere like amusement. Like I really enjoy like watching stand-up comedy. I don't necessarily think I get very deep things out of that. It's just more of a entertainment factor for life that you can have a laugh. Or it can be something in a deeper sense where either the viewer is learning something about themselves or they're learning something about the world, or both of those things at once, which is valuable in terms of changing behaviors or being able to feel like you're able to live a deeper life. And so when you're thinking about entertainment, I think particularly when you're thinking about entertainment and allowing people to understand something in a deeper sense, you often have like levels of sophistication for art. So like the first levels, you might be able to like see the art and take it at face value and say like, oh, this piece of art is like showing um, maybe like some group of people in some period of time. So you might see like a period piece in like the Victorian area and be like, that is what it's depicting. The second is like when you're told the meaning of the art and you can see like to some extent, like after you're told the meaning, why it's the case. So you might see like a painting of a like Victorian lady sitting down, and then someone tells you that, oh, like the fact that her dress is colored black means that she's a widow and her expression is kind of sad and she's kind of in this lonely place. And you might not have like tied those things together necessarily, but now that someone explained it to you, you can see why that is the case. The next step is like when you can independently identify the meaning of the work of art. So that probably means you've done some studies on how to critique art or have some particular understanding of the period of the piece. So maybe like you yourself understand color theory and therefore know that like black denotes sadness and can like now see that in art pieces that you were like you're viewing. And the last is that you can truly understand why the work and its individual components actually matter. So it's not only that you just like are able to independently like verify the meaning of art, but you can actually say what that does for the art world or what people are able to see as a result. So you can say like, oh, it's like not only is it cool that they're able to use black to denote sadness, that's really innovative for XYZ reason, and it like promotes this idea of using colors as symbolism in future forms of art. So that's kind of like different levels of sophistication. And the reason why that matters is if you're talking about art in a debate and it has like a very niche following, you might assume that people have like a very high level of sophistication. But if art is for like a mass level of viewership, it's probably like good to assume that people are more at like the first or second stage of level of sophistication when they're interpreting art, as that affects their entertainment value, especially in how deep of a message they're able to get from the art, especially if it's not a very obviously deep message. And so that kind of relates to like this last point about understanding the audience is important for understanding the entertainment value of art. And so you might have debates about whether or not like the entertainment value should just like push for more simple things like mere amusement, or whether it should push for something in a deeper sense, or if art is actually able to access a deeper sense. And so a good barometer to see if people are able to access a deeper sense is like what level of sophistication you think they're actually interpreting the art at. And if it's not going to be that deep of a level, then maybe like the mere amusement is a better factor to going for when you think about the art piece as a whole. So that's overall how you consider like forms or like the functions of art in terms of debate. And then those are also like general questions to consider and types of motions that you might encounter it in. I think that's basically all the time we had for it because I think we're at the 30-minute mark. But I can also answer questions if people want to ask them or if anything was confusing.